Does Jefferson County favor giving Zoo New York more funding? Zoo officials have asked multiple times with no answers. 7 News reporter Lexi Bruning polls legislators tonight.
Time and time again, Zoo New York Interim Executive Director Mark Irwin has stood before Watertown and Jefferson County asking for more funding. Our first reports of the zoo asking for money trace back to 2020 and extends most recently to Monday night. Zoo New York gained momentum with increased memberships and donations after closing for 6 months in October 2023, but needs help to keep going.
What we're offering is a cost-effective approach that brings real community benefit and multiplies the investment that the city makes.
The zoo's current 5-year plan asks for $375,000 in operational support from City Hall. It's asking the Board of Legislators for $375,000 too. The county is currently sitting on $44 million in savings that isn't assigned to anything. Donning I Heart the Zoo shirts, more than a dozen advocates for Zoo New York asked city lawmakers Monday to include funding in the proposed budget.
And if they don't receive the funding, as Mark was mentioning, and are forced to shut down, the cost of demolition and repurposing that area will far outweigh any of the amount of money that we need every year, they need every year.
Funding for the zoo is not included in the city's proposed budget, but that could change after negotiations. For more than a year, zoo officials have been coming before the Jefferson County Board right here in this room, expressing the dire need for funding. However, it has yet to come up for a vote. 7 News polled lawmakers on Tuesday asking where they stand. Of the 6 county lawmakers who responded whether they would vote to provide funding for the zoo or not, 5 said no, 1 said yes. Legislator Michael Montigelli is for funding the zoo. He says while the zoo belongs to the city, it's a community asset. Legislator Bobby Ferris says the issue won't come to a vote. He says the county gives the zoo money in every budget, giving them extra funds last year to help toward advertising. Legislator Bobby Cantwell says he hasn't heard one constituent from his district tell him to vote yes to keep the zoo open. Jefferson County Chair Bill Johnson says the 2025 operating budget reflects the county's priorities. Additional funding for the zoo is not included in that budget. Lexi Bruning, 7 News.